Welcome, everybody. My name is Paul Rufer. I'm the Vice President of Stanton Street, and I want to say a particular welcome to our teacher tonight, to Emily Goldberg-Weiner. We're really excited. Emily is our Maharat intern at the show. We feel really blessed to have her in our community, and we're really excited about her teaching tonight. I want to ask a favor, Jessica Cooperman, if you're not on our mailing list, please give us some contact information for you and anyone else in this gathering who's a new face. I may know Dahlia Yafet right now. I don't see you. I'm not quite sure. Please let us have contact information so when we're doing great stuff like this, we can be in touch with you. So take the talking stick, Emily, and
Wait, before you start, I just want to let you know I have a class at 7:30, and it's been an ongoing class. So forgive me if I leave early. I'm looking forward to hearing your teaching and apologize to you.
You're double booked with classes is great.
Yeah, well, I've been doing this one for years, so yeah.
What's the class?
Oh, right now it's on the intertestamental books.
Ooh, fun.
Yeah,
that's great. Fabulous.
And I've been up to Maharat. I think it's a fabulous, fabulous thing. So it's nice to meet you.
Oh, yay. I'm happy to hear that. Wow, thank you. It's so nice to be here. Thanks, Paul, for introducing me. I just have to tell you, it's like one of the most humbling feelings right now to be speaking in front of my professor, Dr. Justin Huberman. I just took a class at Revel at Yeshiva University in Jewish history, in like early Jewish history from like the 1800s. And the Professor Gurak, is like, he's a very stern guy and he's been in the field forever. And then I like ever so slightly nudged him with an email saying, do you happen to know Dr. Cooperman? And he's like, I love her. So I've used you many times to just to get into good classes even, but it's so nice to see you. I've heard a lot of love from Margie coming your way. Amazing. So for those who don't know me, my name is Emily. I'm the Rabbinic intern at Stanton Street, which I really loved. Even with Omicron trying to get in between us, it's been really wonderful to be part of this community. When I'm not on the Lower East Side, I live in Riverdale, and I'm in my 4th and final year at Yeshivat Maharat, and I'm currently getting my master's at Revel at Yeshiva University. And yeah, it's just like really exciting to be part of this series, Talking Talmud. And this is like a bit of overview, and we're going to go into one of my favorite sugyot in Talmud. But before even we do that, I would love to just hear, when you think of Talmud, what kinds of associations do you have with it?
Debates, arguments.
Debates, arguments.
I guess I think about the physical layout of the Gemara, which I think is a fascinating and beautiful way to put this whole system onto the printed page.
Love, awesome. That's great. Those are all grumpy rabbis. Yes, that's also very much the case. That's who compiled it. So I think something that I also want to get in your mind is also the idea that it's kind of a dichotomy between the Talmud and other forms of rabbinic literature, especially that came after the Talmud, and the written Torah. When you think of a written Torah, you think of probably a velvet-dressed, crown-adorning scroll that we parade around a shul. We don't leave unattended. And if you drop it, some say you have to fast for 40 days or give a ton of tzedakah. It seems to be like a really serious thing, to the point where we don't touch it with our fingertips when we're reading from it. We use a yad. We like to stay at a distance from it. And there are also all these rules that if it becomes not kosher, or if it rips or smudges, we treat our written Torah with a ton of reverence. So much so that you wouldn't really recognize the way that we engage with the oral Torah, thinking that those two things might be, in fact, a package deal at Mount Sinai, because we treat them so differently. Some would say that we actually treat our oral tradition, anything from Mishnah, Talmud, Shulchan Aruch, and so on, with more intimacy than we treat a Sefer Torah. In the fact that we debate over it, we get to know these personalities who are, many of them take the form of grumpy rabbis. We write notes in it. We come up with tshuvot and responsa, and we engage with issues that we haven't even thought about, that haven't even been addressed yet. And some would say that kind of continuation, but that like level of intimacy that you have with a text is in fact more reverent. So there's always like a debate between like the reverence and commitment of the written Torah, the Sefer Torah that we keep in a closet, versus our rabbinic literature, which is in a Beit Midrash. One of them we kiss with a siddur, and the other one we debate over. We kind of sometimes spill coffee in it. If we drop it, you don't have to fast. There's a very different kind of relationship between these books. And I'd say in the Torah, when you have your 5 books of Moshe, and I know that last week, Rabbi Stoller went through some of like the categories of things that you would see in a Torah, and then how that's kind of become its own life source in the Talmud, how it's kind of transpired and become this ongoing conversation. I would say that another part of the Talmud that I really want to explore is the kinds of snark that the rabbis have. They're chutzpahdik people. They say whatever they want. I'd say like it's one of the earliest forms of sarcasm can be found in the Talmud. And I would say while the Torah has, everything from narrative to lists of laws and things like that, the Talmud, it's very unpredictable in that there's many different tractates of rabbis who are debating about things that I would have just skimmed over. But it turns out there's a lot of ink that is spilled across conversations trying to debate things that are extremely important. But the main reason that they're trying to debate these things is because that's all we have. Because post-temple in 70 CE, the big question of where is God now? The early rabbinic Jews, the Talmud is kind of where we have that process. We're trying to create a sense of cohesion in Jewish life, because now we don't have the temple, the capital T temple. We don't have this place to gather. So now we have to use books, and now we have to use conversations in the oral tradition. So one of the questions I would first have when I was thinking about Talmud for the first time is like, who are these people? I spend a lot of time with evangelical Christians. They're some of my good friends growing up. I grew up in South Florida, which is like Long Island, but also evangelical, like Sunbelt networks. And my friends were always, they kind of asked, and like what I later learned was a bit polemical, but they say like, well, the Talmud was just written by men. And I think I've learned over time that to remove the word just, the Talmud was in fact written by men, many of whom had a lot of nitpicky things to say. But we see that as part of an ongoing project. It's like literally the continuation of Har Sinai is the debates that we have over different generations of people. Essentially, if you could look at the Talmud like a Harry Potter book, a daf has 2 pages on it, which is why people are beginning to learn 2 sides, 2 folios of 1 page every day. But the Mishnah would be like the first line of a chapter in Harry Potter. And then the rest of the daf, up until the next Mishnah is cited, is filled with people debating each word of it. Sometimes not even a debate. Sometimes it's just like a statement with a question mark, which I'm sure you've all experienced sometimes. If someone ever wants to ask you a question and it turns out to just be a comment, like with a question mark at the end, the Talmud is filled with those. And the main thing I want to show you is a depiction of, I think, the quintessential example of how the Talmud is treated as a living and breathing text, but one that is in our hands when it comes to building a sense of community. This is the kind of passage that is often taught in pluralistic spaces. When you're trying to engage with Jewish pluralism and Klal Yisrael, we think of this passage of Talmud as kind of that sharing point. So what is this passage of Talmud? I'm going to share a Google Doc here. Let me know if you have any issue opening it. It should be able, and anybody with the link should be able to access it. And it looks overwhelming, but I basically just took the entire sugya of what is called Tanur Shel Achnai, and I wrote it as though it was a dialogue. instead of a page in the Talmud. In a page in the Talmud, there's no punctuation, and you can't really, there's no chunking of the text. So it's one of the first things I do when I look at a page of Talmud is I first want to chunk the whole thing to make sure that you can understand the flow, because sometimes it's a dialogue. Everyone's able to see it, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Awesome, fabulous. So this text comes from Masechet, the tractate of Bava Metzia, which is in damages. The Seder, the section belonging to damages. There are 6 in the Seder of Mishnah. There are 6 categories. It creates the word Zman Nakat, the acronym Zra'im, Moed, Nashim, Nazikin, Tarot, Kodshim, and Taharot. Sorry, that order. And this is coming from the Nazikin category, which is all about damages, property damages. What happens if my ox runs into your house and buries all of the things you love? Do you have to put my ox to death? Stuff like that. So why this exact sugya would be in Bava Metzia is its own debate that happens in the beginning of the book. But this is smack in the middle of it in the 4th chapter. This is on page 59b. So you'll see that I've included some punctuation here, as well as there's a few words in bold, because I kind of want to point out why some of these words might even exist. So we have here Tanan Hatam. That's literally where this begins. This random sugya begins at Tanan Hatam. Tanan is Aramaic for it was taught, or like we learned here. Hatam means there. We don't know what there is referring to. So it clarifies, Rashi would clarify, it was like a major commentator in the Talmud, would clarify that there means in a Mishnah. So the Talmud, one of the Talmud's favorite things to do is to assume that you also know the entire Talmud, which is really not so accessible. So that's why it's really helpful to get some of these tips, whether from Adin Steinsaltz, who edited and wrote this and kind of organized the Talmud in the Sefaria website. But that's in parentheses, it says Mishnah, but that is not presumed knowledge that we have today, but it's the rabbis kind of pretentiously assume that we know which Mishnah it's talking about. So here it's referring to a Mishnah in Mishnah of Kilayim. So if you cut this piece of pottery into different segments, and then you put sand in between each one. Rabbi Eliezer says mitaher, it's pure. V'chachamim mitmeim. The rabbis and the sages would say it's impure. The actual subject of this debate, I don't think is very relevant. But what's really good to know is that it's a common theme that Rabbi Eliezer of Horkanus, he always has controversial opinions. Rabbi Eliezer is a student of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and his kind of best friend / rival is Rabbi Yoshua. You might see those names come up. So we have here already that in this case, if you put sand here versus there, Rabbi Eliezer says, we're good to go, it's pure, and the Chachamim, who get to be their own voice, is this own majority voice, they say it's impure. Great. That's the only introduction we have to this sugya, and there's nothing else we have going in. And we're also not even going to stay at this exact debate. We're just looking at the dynamic, because now we're moving on to Rabbi Eliezer's his like kind of behavior patterns. So we have here the next line, V'zeh hu tanor shel achnai. This is the oven of achnai. And then if you look at this question right there, it says, my achnai, which is actually a really good question. What's an achnai? And I like that nobody asks that question. If you could see, it doesn't say like, now Paul asks what my achnai, and nobody clarifies it, but rather it's this anonymous sounding voice. I put on the footnote that achnai is that question is being asked by the Gemara, which sometimes is not the most satisfying answer, but often the voices of the Gemara are different generations of rabbis, but they kind of ask these like prodding questions. I'm thinking of it more like those like it could be spark notes questions or guiding questions in a book. So that's big. So by the way, what is achnai? And it literally means, it's the Aramaic term for a snake. So my Achmai, what's the snake we're talking about? Amar Rabbi Huza Amar Shmuel, Shekiput Varvim Ka'achnazo Umitzmuhu. So this is like the rabbis would surround their arguments like a snake that coils, like a coiling snake, which means that they have slippery and slithering opinions, and they're quite smart, like they're cunning. They're able to corner you and think of an argument to challenge what your idea is. And then it says Tana, and that's another thing. It's taught, but we don't know who teaches it. So they always assume you just know who's talking about it. So this is kind of the Chachamim again, the sages teach. But Oto Hayom, Yeshiv Rabbi Eliezer, Kol Tshuvot Sheba'olam, Velo Kiblu Hamino. So this is saying Rabbi Eliezer would be somebody who would answer every single person's questions. He was filled with answers and opinions and debates about things. He was quite known to spend a lot of time in the Beit Midrash. But then it says, Velo Kiblu Hamino, the rabbis did not accept any of his answers. So this is the question of what's achnai, and then we're talking, and then as soon as we defined it, you have that image of a coiling snake in your mind, and now we're talking about Rabbi Eliezer again. He's kind of like the star of the story. So he's somebody, once they figured out what the oven of achnai is, we're thinking of Rabbi Eliezer, because he's the one who's going to be the kind of the key protagonist of the story. Amar lahem, also it's tons of pronouns and it gets a little confusing at times, which is another reason why I like to write it like a script. So it says, Amar lahem, Rabbi Eliezer, im halacha kemotai, cheruv ze yofiach. So he says to them, which I think is rabbis, but it's actually not clear. So it's kind of think about if you want to convince a group of people something, think of whoever in your life would have that kind of power. Because it seems like in this case, Rabbi Eliezer is really determined to convince people of something. So there must be power either in numbers or in students or fellow teachers. If this halacha is like me, doesn't even explain what the halacha is. It could be referring to the pottery and the sand, but it could also just be anything. If the halacha is like my opinion, this carob tree, the carob ze yofiach, will be its proof. Then, lo and behold, nakar charov mimkomo mea ama. So then, just like that, this carob tree was uprooted from its place, 100 cubits tall. Some would say 400 cubits tall. So just like that, Rabbi Eliezer says, if you believe me, if I'm right, this tree will do this, will shoot up. And it did. I added the exclamation points because I find it kind of exciting, but those are not in the Talmud either. And then after Lo, the rabbis say to him, Ein mevi'in ra'ya min hacherev. We don't get proof from magic, like that kind of magic trick of your tree being uprooted. It says Chazar ve'amar lahem. He goes back and says it to them, but I try to imagine there's a little bit of not like a little bit of panic coming back when he's the chazaring and trying to think of another attempt to get him to be believed. Amar lahem. Im halacha kemotai emet hamayim yochichu. If the halacha is according to is like mine, then this water will prove it. This water will serve as that's proof. Chazru emet hamayim la'acharehem. Wow, the water turned backwards and then began flowing in a totally different direction. So exciting. But Amru lo, they say back to him, Ein mavi'in raya me'emet hamayim. We don't get halachic proof. We're not going to believe you because you made that stream do certain things. So now we keep going. Chazar ve'amar lahem im halacha kamoti kolti beit hamidrash yochichu. He says that the halacha is like my opinion because he's pretty insistent at this point. The walls of the Beit Midrash will be that kind of proof. Hatu kolte beit hamidrash lipol. The walls of the Beit Midrash began to lean inward and they were beginning to fall. Pausing there, do we see would this be your order of events if you wanted to prove something? First, it's the carob tree, then it's water, and then it's the walls of a Beit Midrash. Does that feel like it's escalating or de-escalating?
Escalating.
Why? What about it feels like it's escalating?
Well, I assume they're in the Beit Midrash and the walls are gonna like lean on them. I'd get a little nervous.
That's true. I feel like in these other cases, it's like, well, it's really nice if a carob tree comes out, but like our lives aren't impacted either way. And if you can make water dance, cool. Like so can a water fountain. They're like, no, we want to see, it only becomes more real when we are being affected by it. Totally true. How do you how do you feel about Rabbi Eliezer in this? What do you make of him?
Pretty confident.
Confident.
I don't know where he gets his force to be able to do what he does. You kind of wonder.
Yeah, he definitely has.
He seems to know his stuff, and the universe seems to validate it. And what we're learning is that's not good enough.
Yeah, definitely. It seems to be something deeper than being able to prove things on the spot. Yeah, definitely. I like that it doesn't even seem to matter what the debate is. There seems to be kind of like a stubbornness to both. Rabbi Eliezer being whatever the thing is, I will prove it with these different acts of nature. And the Chachamim are like, whatever you're going to prove, we won't hold by. We won't hold by it.
It also seems, Emily, that Rabbi Eliezer is the focus of this Gemara. There's something that this conversation and this personality is coming to teach us.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. So we also see what he does, which I really love this. The next line shows just how I think entertaining the rabbis are in the Talmud, because they're not only engaging with one another. You see the next line that says, Gar Behem Rabbi Yoshua, Amar Lahem. The Lahems are vague, but it seems like Rabbi Yoshua, who is in that room, is kind of annoyed at the walls. He's speaking to the walls, and he yells at them, and he says, Im talmidei chachamim minatzchim ze et ze behalacha item, ma tivchem. If Torah scholars, these students of Torah, are debating each other with halacha, what are you doing here? But he's not saying it, like he's saying lahem, so the plural of that it's either to Rabbi Eliezer plus the walls, or maybe he's literally telling the walls to cool it, which means that Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua both have the ability to make acts of nature take place, but they do it for different reasons. One is doing it to try to show, like, with desperation to be convinced that he's correct, and the other one saying, listen, this is all for a better purpose. This is all for just debating matters of Jewish law. So, like, walls, cool it. Don't take a side. Hold this space up. Which is like kind of a fascinating thing. Another thing is the word menatzchim is like, it says that they're in the definition, the translation of it says like they're contending with each other, they're debating, but this is like they're triumphing. We are triumphing one another in these kinds of matters of halacha. I mean, this is a positive debate that's happening. It seems tense, but like, don't let the walls cave in is kind of how he's speaking to the walls. Like, this is actually okay what we're doing. You know, when you like hear two people screaming at each other, and then you're like, is everything okay? And like, no, we're just friends. Like, we're just talking. And like, well, it sounds like it's like, that's like when there's like a very thin line between, if you hear like a child screaming, there's like, they're either having an amazing time or they're about to be murdered, but it's like a very thin line in between those two things. That's like, no, this is actually a fun debate, which is what Rabbi Yoshua might just be reassuring the walls of the Beit Midrash that might be defensively caving in, because this is getting very tense. So then, but the walls essentially respond, Lo naflu mifnei kavodo shel Rabbi Yoshua, the lo zakbu mipnei kavodo shel Rabbi Eliezer. So they didn't fall because they respected Rabbi Yoshua, but they also didn't remain straight because they respected Rabbi Eliezer. So the walls themselves are modeling compromise. It's kind of like the way we put our mezuzot in the halfway point between Hillel and Shammai, who said all vertical or all horizontal. this is like a similar, the walls even are like, okay, we're not going to completely cave in because we respect Rabbi Yeshua, but we're also not going to be completely upright because Rabbi Eliezer wants us to prove, like even the walls are having these kinds of spirited debates. When I think of like the walls kind of speaking for themselves, I also think of the Stanton Street Shul. And like, if you walk into the shul, all you have to do is look right and left on the walls and know that there's like a really, really rich history that happens. And clearly so many conversations have been recorded and even modeled on the very walls of the shul. So it's both fascinating and reassuring to think that these walls are like conversing with one another in a way. But then we have the Chazar ve'amar lahem, the next line, which we know because of the word Chazar, we can associate that with Rabbi Eliezer, even in the midst of the pronoun confusion. So he returns and says to them, Im halacha kimoti min hashamayim yochichu. If the halacha is like my opinion, then literally heaven will prove it. Yatzda bat kol ve'amra malachem etzel Rabbi Eliezer shehalacha kumoto bekol makom. Then a divine voice comes from heaven and says, why are you guys giving Rabbi Eliezer a hard time? Don't you know that the halacha is like what he says? Do you know that he's right all the time? The acronym, the kaf chuk mem, is the kol makom, in every place. This is every matter of halacha. Don't you know that it's always like him? First of all, if you've ever imagined having an encounter with God in the midst of a conversation, I would hope for your behalf that God wouldn't come down from Shemayim to tell you that the other person's right. That would be really sad. But there is something to be said. This is very common in Gemara, which is like the insertion of God. God is suddenly brought in on these really mundane matters. Suddenly God is not in a burning bush that's not being consumed. God doesn't seem to have this like bellowing voice, like as featured in The Prince of Egypt, which is pretty much how I viewed God up until college. And in this case, God is coming in the middle of a dispute, but as a divine feminine. What do you make of that? That the bat kol is female?
Interesting.
Both the feminine and also just like this, it's just as common to have a stream move backwards as it is to just bring God down from Shemayim. What do you make of that kind of like flexibility or that kind of confidence that the rabbis have?
You think the miracles described in the story are all assumed to be metaphorical?
I can see that. Yeah. But then what's this one? What would the metaphor of the bat kol be?
Well, like you, I do find it interesting that it's bat kol. I wouldn't have known that if you hadn't pointed it out.
Isn't that fascinating? Like, we really haven't encountered the bat kol, maybe since like with Abraham and like in the book of Bereshit, or maybe you could say Bat Yah, the daughter of Paro, could be the embodiment of the divine feminine. But in Gemara, in the Talmud, and they're debating something so tachlis, it seems rather odd that suddenly the bat kol, like suddenly has nothing better to do than to come in between this debate, which feels like almost like an intentional move on the rabbi's part, which is, I think, that the epitome of escalation. If you can't yeah.
I was going to ask Emily if you're suggesting that when the term bat kol gets used, this is the way in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu is speaking to Klal Yisrael. So he speaks from a woman's voice. Is that what it might be suggesting?
It is interesting. There's a lot of different names for God in the Talmud. A lot of them end with the feminine vowel. Like another term for God in the Talmud is Rahmana, Hamar Rahmana, like mercy, merciful one. And that's used also just as casually and interchangeably. But you would also see a Kadosh Baruch Hu in the Talmud a lot. Ribono Shel Olam is a big one that's often used. So it seems like bat kol is used as interchangeably as the other ones. But I'm wondering if it's kind of, maybe it kind of reminds me of like the way, you know how like Siri on your phone or Maps is like the default is a woman's voice. The assumption is that I know someone who works in the UX development of it, and they say that it was designed in a slightly sexist way, but the idea that you won't get frustrated with a woman's calm voice giving you instructions. And it gives more people confidence to maybe not listen all the time and to experiment. What if I take that shortcut instead? And the fact that there's like some kind of calmness and like a reassurance in a feminine voice. And I kind of wonder if maybe that's if there's supposed to be something maternal about the Yatzda Bat Kol and saying like, new guys, like what's the big deal? Like he's the one who's right. But I feel like it's used a little bit more in like a more intentional way. I feel like Rabbi Eliezer would be the one who would control this narrative. Like, see, like even God agrees with me. Like it seems like I don't know what to make of it.
It could be just showing that God has a feminine side as well as a masculine side because he is one only.
Yeah.
And just, you know, giving him a human anthropomorphic way of discussing things. And because if you're reading not in the Talmud, but you're reading the Torah, that doesn't sound feminine when you think you hear or see the words. That's not feminine. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah.
But in his way.
That's really cool. I like that.
Can't put that in a box. That's why.
Fascinating. Yeah. I like that. And it seems like, yeah, it could just be manifesting a different part of God, which is, yeah, just as similar as reaching out to the masculine parts. And perhaps it wouldn't have changed very much in the story. It would still be just as wild, say Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu instead of Bat Kol. This very use of like the rabbi's ability to just bring in God as one form of proof and a long list of proof. What's also fascinating is like you would think that maybe if you brought in the Bat Kol at a first time, it would be a non-starter. Like the whole debate would end. Is like one thought, but then you'll see in their response that it doesn't quite work that way either. So he says that after the Bat Kol comes in and says, "Didn't you all know? Like, why are you guys giving Rabbi Eliezer a hard time?" The halacha is like him in pretty much every place, every time he inserts an opinion. Then you have the response, which is Amad Rabbi Yoshua al Raglav, the Amar, by quoting Devarim, he stands up, which makes me wonder, like, was he sitting before? Was he in the back? Something about him standing up. Now I feel like there's a leveling happening. He stands up and quotes Devarim, which is one of the Talmud's best ways to kind of validate their debate. If you quote the Torah, then you are really good footing there, because that's like the proof text, essentially. So he uses a proof text in the Torah and says, Lo b'shamayim hi. It is not in heaven. He stands up and says, the Torah is not in heaven. And he's quoting that from Devarim, which is referring to the pasuk that says, it's not in the heavens, when you could say, who among us can go up to the heavens and get it for us, that we may observe it, referring to the Torah. And the answer is not there anymore. It's not in heaven. So Lo b'shamayim hi. And then the same kind of question is ma tanor shal my achnai. This is my lo b'shamayim hi. This anonymous voice, which in this case is the Gemara, is asking this question, this guiding question. What do you mean it's not in heaven? My means what, but it's imagine a what with like two question marks and an exclamation point. It's kind of like, what? You lo b'shamayim hi? What is the context of that? And Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, Shekvar natzna Torah mehar Sinai ein anu mashgichin bebat kol. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, no idea where he was this whole time, kind of just shows up, says, since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we don't regard a divine voice. The Torah was already given. The bat kol has no vote. God doesn't have a vote.
Yeah, I need a feedback.
Isn't that wild? Then it says, we don't use, like, God is not our mashgiach. You know, if you don't go to a certain kosher restaurant or certain restaurants, like, well, there's no mashgiach there, so I can't trust their kashrut. Well, we don't hold by the mashgichut of God. God is not our mashgiach because the Torah is not in heaven, which means it belongs to us. So then it literally says, Shekvar katva b'har Sinai b'Torah, quoting the book of Shemot now, since you already wrote the Torah at Har Sinai, it says the phrase acharei rabim lahatot. We incline towards a majority. Doesn't matter that Bakul votes like Rabbi Eliezer, the Chachamim say no. So guess what? God lost. Like, because God has not even one vote, God has no vote, which is like kind of wild if you think about it. Lo bashamayim hi. When you hear that phrase, what comes into your mind? For me, it's like pure chutzpah, but I'd be curious if anyone else has a different opinion about that idea. That God doesn't have a vote.
To say God is defeated, finally he understands his people have it. They make the decisions. Did you hear what I said?
Could be that that the thought is to encourage debate amongst humans and not just have everything just ruled from above, but figure it out for yourselves.
Yeah, definitely. Right, and what's interesting is, like, we don't really know when the bat kol just disappeared again, but it sounds like Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Yirmiyah are saying that in the bat kol's presence. Like, it seems kind of chutzpah to say in front of God, like, sorry, God, we don't hold by God. So but it definitely makes sense if, like, especially if the bat kol wasn't there anymore, or the bat kol was there. We don't really know how God felt about it.
This seems to be an act of differentiation. You know, that what I'm, the idea that, as it says, acharei rabim lahatot. I mean, the law has got to be determined by rabbis, by people on the ground.
Yeah, definitely.
So this particular story, I've taken a few different Jewish learning classes, and this story is regularly introduced. And I assume that it is because, kind of what Paul said, it is the story that says the Talmud or the rabbis and are deciding what the religion is about, and also that the majority rules, that it's not a cult of the personality, it's the cult of the community. So those two statements appear to be kind of laced throughout this story. And I think that's why it often gets introduced as a key story to kind of take on any Jewish learning.
Definitely. I try to avoid the phrase like this is a classic or a famous Gemara, but in pluralistic Jewish spaces, this is one of those. Like it's like the orientation of any Jewish pluralistic summer program or school experience. It kind of, but sometimes I wonder what the goal of that is. Like what is the project of this story? Like what is it trying to disarm? What kinds of opinions is it trying to, or myths is it trying to debunk? Because I feel like this story, when I said Lo Bashamayim Hi to my very, very firm evangelical friends, like it feels a little bit chutzpah. Like, what do you mean God has no vote? Like, you don't have to be an evangelical Christian to find this to be very chutzpah. So yeah, I'm curious, are we trying to combat this?
That God has no vote, or is it that we have agency and we have choice? We have to make choice. And we have to do that as community. We have a process that, I mean, it's not, it sounds individualistic. It's not. There's a protocol.
Right. Definitely. Definitely. Right, because they're still voting. They still also outnumber Rabbi Eliezer. It's not just everyone but God. It's the minority voices. Like, we work in a majority community now, and these outliers, while they're still listed in Gemara, they're still outlier voices. My favorite part of this story is the last 2 lines. Which, Dolores, who is that? Who is that?
This is Lily.
Hi. Hi, Lily.
Sorry.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Lily's so sweet. So the last 2 lines, we are now we're zooming out even more, because it says Eshkache Rabbi Natan Eliyahu. We know this is zooming out because this Eliyahu is the one and only Eliyahu Navi, the prophet, who the assumption is if Rabbi Natan, whoever that is speaking to him, the assumption is that this is in Olam Haba, years and years and years later. He found him, Rabbi Natan found Eliyahu Navi, and he says to him, "My Aved Kadosh Baruch Hu v'hahi shata." What did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that time? And that's referring to when Rabbi Yeshua said, "Lo b'shamayim hi." What was God feeling or thinking? Amar lo, he said to him, "Kach chayecha ve'amar nitzchuni banai, nitzchuni banai." God smiled and said, "My children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me." Seems like God gets a kick out of us trying to establish Jewish community and trying to interpret Torah. And I think God finds our chutzpah a little bit entertaining and thinking yeah, that's what they were created to do. This is exactly what I wanted. I'm not a parent myself, but I imagine if there's times where your children or your grandchildren can imitate you or can quote you, or have any of your same mannerisms, there might be some kind of pride you might feel, some kind of nachas. It's yeah, I created them. They're quoting my Torah back at me. And I feel that's kind of what God's feeling. But the phrase nitzchuni banai is God is shepping nachas at seeing people do that.
As a parent of 3 kids between the age of 18 and 22, I feel that in spades. And so when I read it, I know it. And I actually think there is a joy in having that feeling that way, as I would assume if there's, any veracity to the, I don't know, realness of the story, that God would feel the same. I feel it. I'm sure he or she does also.
It's beautiful. I would agree. This is what I think that's what my parents are doing.
Yeah.
So there's I am obsessed with this next midrash because now that we know the story, I want to see that story essentially flipped. Because what we've established in Tanur Shel Achnai is that when left to our devices, rabbis and individuals and the majority creates law. We create norms. We create halakha. And God finds that so entertaining when we remind God that the Torah belongs to us now. So we're here to make life out of it. Here is a modern midrash written by Dr. Tamar Biala. She compiled this whole thing in a book called Dirshuni, which is a woman's modern Israeli women's midrash. I think this is a class we'll be teaching in the coming few weeks for the women's group at Stanton Street. So we'll do a whole class just on Dirshuni, which is truly incredible. you're going to recognize the same tropes in this story. It says, Ba'oto Hayom, same as the before in the Tanur Shel Achmai story, but instead of Rabbi Eliezer, it has a woman. There's a woman who doesn't have a name. There's a woman who was denied a get. As you know, divorce is now unilateral in the Orthodox community, so husband must present his wife with a get. And in this case scenario, a woman was not given one, which is a form of spousal abuse. She was denied a get, and she went to what is assumed to be the Beit Din. She went to the Beit Din and gave them all of her reasons and all of her answers, and they did not approve of her demanding a get or annulling her marriage. Amra lahem l'chachamim, she says to the chachamim, Tanu li get be'etzeh, give me a get and I'll go. Amru la, they say to her, ha'ish megaresh ve'ein ha'ish megaresh ela l'ritzono. The man divorces his wife and he must only do so voluntarily. We can't coerce him. This is actually an identical argument that it happens in the Agunot crisis, which is, you can't be coerced to give your spouse a get. It must be done on your own volition. And then she literally says, Kapuhu leget, force him to give me a get, and force me to get a get, since the Talmud teaches they beat him until he says, I want to. So you can nudge him enough and make his life, basically make him a social outcast until he just decides that he wants to. You can always coerce someone to want to do something, is her argument. Amrula, they say to her, Einanu yocholim l'chapo, we can't do that. We can't force him, because then the get might not be valid because he didn't really want it. And then if you, this woman, get remarried and you have a kid, it might be a mamzer. At that moment, a carob tree was uprooted 100 feet, some would say 400 feet, or cubits. Ra'u chachamim below hiskichu b'davar. The rabbi saw it and they didn't hold by that carob tree. Amra lahem, im kach hareini almana chaya. If that's the case, if you don't give me a get, I will be a living widow. Amrullah, kvar ne'amar tav ten do milamitev armalo. A woman prefers in tandem rather than being alone, is their response to her. This anonymous Beit Din's response to this woman. Amra lahem, she says to them, Aval kach v'kach asa li ba'ali. My husband did this and this to me. V'hu me'us elai. He's repulsive to me. Ve'eni kishbuya l'haba'al l'shenui li. How am I not like someone who's an inmate, a prisoner to this person who treats me this way? They say to her, Amrullah, mi anu shenashim rishono bein harim gdolim v'yesh lahush l'rosh. So who are we that we should put our heads in between these two mountains? This is a suspicious amongst our authorities. This is like the Rabbanim ba'amurayim. This is like a huge disagreement with our authorities. At that moment, the channel of water, the stream went backwards, and it came and it was beginning to do those similar nature-like proofs, but they didn't hold by that kind of proof. Amra lahem hivgiu kedushai she'asali davar shelo kehugan. Annul my marriage. Instead of forcing him to give me a get, you could erase my marriage from the onset, like find a fault in it, for he's treated me inappropriately, and I wouldn't have gotten married to someone who treated me inappropriately. Amrila ein lanu smachut. We don't have that kind of authority. Smachut is like the word smicha. So to get like ordained is like the term for smichut. We cannot be relied upon, is what they're saying. She says, Amra lahem, batzlu kedushai betanat mikach ta'ut. Annul my marriage on the basis of this mikach ta'ut. This was not an accurate sale, meaning this wasn't the person I thought I was going to marry. So the whole acquisition through kedushin is all wrong. Shalu yadati shekach v'kach yaseli lo haytam mitzriach v'niselo. If I'd known that he was going to be abusive, I wouldn't have married him. Amrullah ein anu yicholim. Be'oto sha'ah hitu kolte beit hamidrash lipo hama meitim v'holchim. At that moment, the walls of the Beit Midrash leaned and they began to fall, and they are still leaning to this day. Amrullah, ein zo ta'ana. Oh wait, sorry. This point says Amra lahem Beit din avihem shel yatomim hu, v'ki ein ani yatoma v'galmuta. She said to them, isn't the Beit Din the father of orphans? Am I not orphaned and abandoned? Aren't you guys supposed to be doing your job of protecting me from this abusive marriage and giving me a get? Amra lahem, amrullah, ein zo ta'ana. This is not a claim that we need to abide by. Vein anu shom'im te'onatayich klal. Shema bekesh mimech davar v'lo tetlo. Perhaps he asked you for something and you didn't give it to him. Maybe it's your fault. Nice. That's great. Thanks, Beit Din. Yatzda bat kol ve'amra malachem etzel isha zo sheba'ala me'us aleha ve'ein atzricha liten lo davar bishvil shetikabel et kita. The bat kol, the same bat kol, comes down and says, hello, what do you guys have? What's up with your deal with this woman? Can't you know that she deserves a get? Give her a get. Perhaps literally just give a get. This husband is disgusting to her. She doesn't need to give him anything in order to receive a get. Amru chachamim lo b'shamayim hi ve'ein anu mashgichim bebat kol. The same thing as the Tanur Shel Achnai, the same parallel. They say the Torah is not in heaven. It's for us to decide. And then Be'ota sha'a haya bocher hakadosh baruch hu ve'omer nitzchuni banai, nitzchuni banai. That moment, God cries and says, my children have defeated me. My children have defeated me. And it's the same verb as triumph.
Don't you think this story, though, is a little bit more bitter than the first one? In the first one, they were arguing about something nonsensical. Like, who cared what was going on with an oven, right? This one is about some woman who's sort of, I don't know, and who knows exactly what's going on, but it sounds like it's a terrible situation, right? And the rabbis are making the decision, and nothing's changing their mind, no matter what she says or no matter what God says. It's the same story, but it doesn't have the same ring to it.
Yeah.
What seems different, though, in the first story, I don't think God cries. Here, God cries. Yes. Am I accurate, Emily?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think
No, he laughed in the first one.
I'm wondering if there's a musar here. And the musar is that the beautiful Torah can be abused.
Yeah.
I mean, Lo Bashamayim here is a wonderful, statement about autonomy and differentiation. But Lo Bashamayim, he can be manipulated to keep people captive.
Can I go back to the Eliezer story?
Sure.
I'm going to challenge you. Okay. We just learned in the Torah that the Bnei Israel was at the foot of the mountain, and they said, we hear and we will do. In the Eliezer story, the third verse comes down from heaven. God says that Eliezer is correct about the oven. So if they don't listen to God, how can they then make laws?
So your question is, let's help me get this right. If the Torah once didn't belong to them, who are they to make laws without acknowledging that the Torah once was in Shemayim? Did I get that right? It seems like
you understand the challenge is if they don't listen to God, and we gave our that we will hear and do, and now they're not listening to God.
Yeah.
So, Eliezer is correct, according to God, according to everything else. They're posking incorrectly in the face of God. So how do we now accept the rebellion or the assembly or the majority?
Yeah. What happens when the rabbis disagree with God, but because there's more rabbis than God, suddenly it doesn't matter that God said yes. But the tricky part in the Gemara story is that God smiles at this. God's like, look at what my children have done. They're doing exactly what I'm shepping nachas. It's so beautiful. They're debating the Torah with their own hands. And then, just like Paul pointed out, there's a bit of Musar we can learn, because sometimes if you have that mindset, it could come to a fault, because then you could actually disregard God entirely in times in which, when the Torah lo bashamayim he could be abused. It's truly a stumper. It's really difficult. When is it a good thing that lo bashamayim he we can make life out of this Torah, and when is it like, oh man, we're going off the rails with this?
Don't you think there's a little irony? I don't know, this might sound a little heretical, but the rabbis of that time frame, as I think somebody used the word agency, they felt empowered, they had agency. It was okay for them to sort of define things as they saw fit, right? Based on debate and some level of majority. But in our current time, we struggle to sort of set the laws that are different than the laws they set in Halakha 1,200 years ago, right? There becomes an impediment around that, as if it was God speaking.
I think there's something really interesting about today. I feel like people try to speak and quote God and be like, this is what I'm doing because I'm speaking as God's agent, versus in this Gemara story, they don't even regard God. They're like, okay, whatever. We don't hold by that. Today, I find that we're doing more. I find that rabbis today are working more in the realm of like, well, God, of course, would agree with me if God were to appear from Shemayim, which is sometimes why the conversations feel even more loaded, versus in this Gemara story, it's like entertaining to read. It's like truly entertaining. This midrash, the work of feminist midrash, it's only Gemara-like in the format. It's definitely a different kind of a read on it. And I think there's sometimes a point where you can imagine in day to day, especially given the conversations that you see in like broader, be it shul politics or rabbis or in the Talmud or in rabbinic literature, it's a little bit like, I think we've done the same thing that we've done in this Tanur Shel Achnai story, where we've said, no, God, whatever, God, lo b'shamayim hi. This is for us to figure out. What's even more abusive is now when we bring in that, when we try to suggest that what we are doing would be aligned with the Badkol. So there's something both chutzpahdik and kind of honest about the Tanur Shel Achnai story that I really do admire in a lot of ways. And then thinking sometimes, yeah, there's limits. There are limits to how authoritative the rabbis get to be, even if they're the majority. I think about this especially with the politics around conversion. It's really a huge, a good friend of mine, she's tutoring a couple to convert. And the process is so not linear and it's not transparent in any way that sometimes there's a lot of like horror stories about people's conversions to Judaism. Some of them are fabulous and easy, and I hope that for everybody. But there's some of them that are so windy and so subjective and arbitrary that it makes me kind of feel like somewhere in between the Tanur Shel Achnai and the nameless woman who is standing before a Beit Din. There's something very like vulnerable about it. I just want to be mindful of the time because it's already 8 o'clock. Just before we go, if you could just type in the chat, anybody who needs a refuah shlema. I forgot to do this in the beginning, but we just learned a lot. It could be like to uplift anybody who you know who's sick. Feel free to utilize the chat, or you can just say their name to uplift them in this space.
Thank you, Emily.
Emily, sorry. For Miriam Bat Imunala.
Miriam Bat Imunala. I'm gonna write that I'm gonna type that down. Thank you.
And if there's anyone on the call who's not on our mailing list, to please input that on your chat, and I'll take it and we'll get you informed about activities that we're doing.
Amazing. Any last thoughts, questions before we
Thank
go?
you very much, Emily. Very
Emily,
nice.
I just have I'm a total ignoramus. And when did it all stop? Nowadays, we really don't have the same agency. The rabbis today are kind of stuck in an old framework. And when exactly did that, stagnate and solidify? How long ago did we stop making decisions and having discussions the way the rabbis of the story of the Talmud? Like, I understand that they were imbued with Ruach Shemayim and Ruach Hashem, but like when did we decide we weren't that we were?
It's an awesome question. I think it depends on who you ask. One of my favorite conservative rabbis, his whole thing is like, it hasn't ended. Like, this is the work. This is why we write Tshuvot. This is why we grapple with different issues of our time. I'm like, I want to agree with that, but I find that in the Orthodox community, the innovation feels much smaller, maybe sometimes even granular. It's hard to sometimes grab it. But I do think it's still kind of happening. Like, the Talmud doesn't have anything to say about trans people, about refugees, about non-binary people, about physician-assisted suicide, and all of these like fascinating topics. So people are grappling with them. So I would say that the tshuva process that follows the Shulchan Aruch, which is codified much later than the Talmud. I'd say the biggest thing though is that we don't paskin by the Talmud. The Talmud doesn't. We can't make rules or arguments based on the Talmud. The Shulchan Aruch does that. So I'd say in terms of, but the conversations that people have that are rooted in this discourse, those are ongoing. But I'd say depending on which Jewish movement you ask, some would say it's literally a continuation of the revelation at Har Sinai, and others would say it's like holy work that's emulating what the rabbis have done.
Yeah,
I would say.
I'm wondering if a follow-up to Phyllis's question is, when did authority begin to unravel? I mean, there used to be authority, right? I mean, is it possible that rabbis took over because Hashem, reduced himself, was Mesamsem, and there was Churban Bayit, and this is what was required to survive? But I'm not sure where I'm going with that question, but it seems to me part of the dilemma is the ability to acknowledge, to create an authority and empower it.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that every Beit Din is unique unto itself. There's a machloket in the klal that really keeps us from perhaps being vital. I'm not expressing it well, but authority seems to be a piece of this.
Yeah, definitely. There's a joke that there's a sign on a restaurant that's a kosher restaurant. They say, we're looking for a Mashiach. And someone's like, I don't think that's the word you meant. You're looking for a Mashiach to help check the kashrut of the food. You are one letter away from seeing that person checking your lettuce as suddenly being the redemption of all the Jewish people. It's a really big jump. It's a huge promotion. And I think that kind of speaks to the way we treat authority in general. They're always one letter away from being the Mashiach.
Well,
It's tricky.
again, thank you, and thank everybody for showing up. We'll see you next week.
Yes, amazing.
Thank you. Very interesting.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Can
you
I
so
ask-
much, Emily.
Can I
Send my
ask one more
undying love to
question?
Blackers.
You got
Um,
it.
Thanks, Emily. Nice to
Thank
see you,
you.
Jessica, again, twice in 1 week.
Yay!
Have a good
Before
one,
we go, can
everyone.
I ask you one more question?
Please.
When did the 39 Melachot come about? When was it decided on?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I imagine it was like, well, it is biblical. These are Deoraita laws. I imagine they were listed in the Torah, but they really took off it like around the Shulchan Aruch time. Like there's definitions of what work are. That's like in the Torah. But I think it was really, actually the Mishnah is probably the first one that lists all of them.
Mishnah?
And then I think the Mishnah is where you would find them. I think. I'll get back to you though.
Okay.
Amazing.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nice to meet you all.
But by the way, are you familiar with people on the West Side?
Sure.
My son is Dove Kleiner.
Dove
Sharon Sharon Hersfeld.
I know Sharon Klein. Who's Sharon Kleiner?
Yeah.
Where do
My
they-
son is on the security of JCC.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, they also will daven in Dachei Noam.
Oh, I love Darchei Noam.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's how I recognize them. Recognize those names. Darchei Noam is a really sweet place. Do you live on the Lower East Side?
Pardon?
Where do you live?
I live on the Lower East Side.
Cool. Great.
That's where they grew up.
Oh, that's awesome. I love that. Very cool. Wow. And nice to meet you, Sharon.
Okay, thank you again.
Have a good one. Take care. Be well.